Thank you.
Congressman Rogers, alas, could not be with us here today, but the person who put ACPS together will give him the privilege of the first question.
Okay.
He said to me. It has to do with a different aspect of Russia's involvement in the Middle East. He said that Russia has announced a new intelligence sharing agreement with Syria, Iran, and Iraq to fight ISIS. Putin, he says, does appear to be taking ISIS seriously. How will this impact U.S. strategic interests in the region?
Well, first of all, now we're concerned about sharing intelligence with Iraq, because some of that information could find its way into Russia's hands. It makes it more difficult for us to cooperate. Let me say another development today. The Iraqi leadership is now saying they would welcome Russian airstrikes inside of Iraq itself, thereby expanding even further the reach of the Russians in the region. They've been complaining for a long period of time about the lack of U.S. support to the government in Baghdad. They look at these airstrikes and say, we know what American power looks like. We saw it during the invasion of Iraq. This is not American power. This almost feels like it's symbolic. So it's a deep concern. It is an additional impediment now, and it is a part of a broader effort to pry the Iraqi government away from the U.S. sphere of influence and towards an Iran, a Shia, Iran, Iraq, Russia axis.
So should the U.S. stop intelligence sharing with Iraq now?
No, I think what the U.S. should say to them very quickly is, you know that if I were president, we would make very clear that we're much more reliable and capable partners than the Russians. We would actually come forcefully forward with a real strategy. And I think if we give them the option of a real American strategy, the Iraqi leadership would rather work with us than with Russia. But if you have to choose between effectless American policy and a Russia who's willing to be more aggressive, they're fighting for their survival. They're going to choose Russia every time. So I do believe that given the choice between real American leadership and what Russia's offering, they will choose to work with us instead, and that's what I would do.
So what will this real American strategy look like in the Rubio administration?
Well, here's the difficulty of it. First of all, obviously the government in Iraq is largely controlled by Shia, but ISIS is a Sunni movement, and we can't defeat ISIS without Sunni elements taking them on themselves. So I've long argued that we need to put together a coalition of Sunnis to defeat ISIS. Ultimately, ISIS must be defeated militarily on the ground by Sunnis themselves. And I would ask our Sunni partners in the region, the Egyptians, the Saudis, the Gulf kingdoms, the Jordanians, and others, to contribute troops to this cause, along with Iraqi Sunnis and Syrian Sunnis, into a capable fighting force that we would support with logistical support, intelligence support, and additional airstrikes to confront ISIS directly and defeat them. And that would be my strategy towards addressing it. In the absence of that, you are basically outsourcing the entire fight to Shia militia that are controlled and sponsored by Iran, and whose ultimate aim is not simply to defeat ISIS, but to turn Iraq into a puppet state, basically a client state of Iranian influence.
Switching to Syria for just a moment, you have recommended the deployment of special forces and other military personnel in Syria. What exactly are you talking about?
I'm talking about embedding them alongside the force that I've just described to you for purposes of improving targeting. We cannot have the kind of targeting success that we want without forces on the ground to identify targets and call in the strikes. And we don't have that now.
Are you talking about American ground troops?
American Special Forces, yes. In addition, I do believe that right now we should be conducting special operations missions targeted specifically at ISIS leadership. One of the reasons why ISIS is able to attract new donors and new recruits is because they win a propaganda war. They go out and conduct some spectacular killing of some sort. They behead someone on video. They put these videos up, and they're making themselves appear invincible. I think we need to conduct some special operations conduct towards them that captures senior leaders, that defeats them, and we need to publicize that on social media to show the world that these guys are not invincible. That is the only way in the short term that we're going to be able to ebb the flow of money and fighters that are now joining that movement, all on the basis of what is a very good propaganda effort that they're undertaking.
Just to be clear, you've talked about special forces and that. Are you talking about any more military commitment involving American boots on the ground in Syria?
Well, I believe ultimately, if that's ultimately the only choice left, there's no way we can live in a world where ISIS survives. But I don't believe that embedding regular American troops on the ground is the best way to do it, and I don't believe we need to do it. I believe the only way you can defeat ISIS is they have to be defeated by Sunni Arabs themselves on the ground. They are the only ones that can ultimately defeat them, not just militarily, but ideologically. They need to be rejected by Sunnis themselves. In some ways, reminiscent to the Sunni uprising that occurred that drove al-Qaeda out of Iraq a number of years ago. If you want to defeat ISIS entirely, they have to be defeated by local forces of Sunnis themselves who reject them. And that's why I think the better approach, the one with the highest probability of success, is the one I've described. We will have to help with air support. They don't have an air force, and we will have to help them. But ultimately, the fight on the ground has got to be conducted by Sunnis, alongside some special operators that will be there for training and targeting purposes.
Training hasn't been commercially successful.
In Syria.
In fact, it's been a disaster.
Yes, it has. And because it took too long. They should have started earlier. At the beginning...
So what do you do now?
Well, let me just back up, because this is an important lesson. At the beginning of the conflict against Assad, the people who rose up against Assad was not ISIS, it was Syrians. And there were army defectors, there were others who rebelled against them. They were not radical jihadists, they were just Syrians that were tired of being oppressed. That was the moment for us to get involved. And I warned, I said, if we don't get involved and find some of these people that are not Islamists and train them into a capable fighting force, it's going to leave a huge vacuum. And that vacuum is going to be filled by what it's always filled by in the Middle East, radical jihadists. And that's exactly what happened. And so today there simply aren't enough of these fighters left. Either they've gone into exile, they've been killed. Some have actually joined the radical movement because they're the guys with the guns and the weapons. And so it's much more difficult to do that now. That being said, I continue to believe that we do need to identify, for example, Sunni elements in Iraq and in Syria that we can work with. But that's become increasingly difficult because they're the first ones that Putin went after. Putin specifically targeted these groups that we have worked with in the past. He's trying to destroy them so that then he can turn to the world and say, look, the only people left fighting Assad is ISIS. You have to help Assad because there's no one else left here. I've destroyed them.
So despite the failures of U.S. efforts to train forces on the ground to fight against Assad, you think we should continue that effort?
Well, we should continue, well, not the current effort. I think we should continue one that actually has a chance of working. Well, first of all, I think it's going to be more and more difficult to attract Syrian fighters now. But there are elements still there. Well, there are still elements there that we can help train. But part of it is they don't have an operating space. So one of the things I've called for is the creation of a safe zone in Syria that the Turks have expressed an interest in cooperating with, so long as it's part of a broader effort that also gets rid of Assad in the long term. And in that safe zone, allow a provisional government to be established, fighters to be trained, refugees to seek refuge so they don't have to go into Europe. That's the first step in creating that process. I think our chances... How do we guard it? With the U.S. no-fly zone, protected by the U.S. no-fly zone, protected by this joint Sunni force that I've described on the ground. That would be there as well to protect its borders. I think that until you've created a zone where they can operate from and organize themselves, you're not going to have success in either attracting recruits or in being able to conduct operations on their behalf. It will not be easy. It has gotten harder to do because of what the administration has failed to do.
Who do you see as the greater threat to American interests? Is it Assad or is it ISIS?
Well, I think they're both threats for different reasons. ISIS is a threat because they're a radical terrorist group who envisions not simply being like Al-Qaeda that conducts external operations. They actually intend to control territory and in some ways have the elements of a nation state. And it's a real threat because they're not going to stop with Iraq. Their intentions are Lebanon, Jordan, Saudi Arabia. They'll continue to grow and they continue to try to recruit foreigners, including people living in the United States. Assad is a threat for a different reason. Number one, he's a complete puppet of Iran and therefore Iran's ambitions in the region. But number two, he has historically always given safe haven to all sorts of terrorist elements, for example, Hezbollah and so forth. Many of which, he was also a transit point for many of the IEDs that Iran was able to get into Iraq to kill Americans. And so he also is a threat to the long-term stability, has always been an enemy of the United States, not to mention of his own people.
You've indicated, if I'm correct, that the first priority, though, should be to get Assad out of power. Am I right?
I don't think you can get rid of ISIS as long as Assad is there. In fact, as long as Assad is there, if it's not ISIS, a new group will emerge. There will be Jabhat al-Nusra who does. As long as Assad is in power, there will be a radical jihadist anti-Assad movement. And our allies in the region will not cooperate in an effort that isn't involved in getting rid of Assad as well. Let's not forget what we're talking about here. We're talking about an individual who gassed his own people with poison chemical weapons. We're talking about an individual that has presided over the barrel bombing of civilian populations. Not to mention the person who, for decades, that government and previously to that, his father, has provided assistance to all these anti-American, anti-Israeli terrorist organizations in the region. Damascus was a way station for virtually every major anti-American terrorist group in the Middle East. He'll continue to be that, except now even more empowered and with Russian air support.
Is it possible that Russia's intervention in the air over Syria actually galvanizes the West to get moving on a political settlement? in Syria?
Well,
is there enough left?
I don't think there potentially is, because I think Putin's ambitions are very different than what the West would want. First of all, it's difficult to envision Syria any time in the near future becoming once again a cohesive nation state because of the number of people that have left, because of the death and destruction that's been created by the civil war. I'm not sure you can come up with a government that can govern that entire space at any time in the short term. I think the best we can hope for is the emergence of a reasonable alternative to Assad that could eventually, through a political solution, empower itself to be in Damascus as well. And that being said, I don't think that's the interest of Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin wants Assad or someone just like him to be there for purposes of influence that it gives him in the Middle East. The influence of the naval base, the influence of now the air base, but also the influence of a staging operating center from which he can project power in neighboring countries. Very different interest than ours.
Some people have suggested that he's also motivated by a desire to distract the Russian people from sanctions and the economic benefit they have had.
That's absolutely
from
true.
what's happening in Ukraine.
Absolutely.
So, in fact, this is a manifestation not only of strength, but of some weakness.
Well, I think internally and domestically, he's still a politician. And what he is trying to do to project is 2 points. And number one, he is trying to distract from the Ukrainian situation and the sanctions that are on. He's trying to distract the world from what's happening in Ukraine. But he's trying to show the people of Russia that he's a strong geopolitical player, that Russia is a relevant geopolitical force under his leadership. And that, of course, strengthens the internal support that he has, at least in his mindset.
Just want to touch on Afghanistan for just a moment, because there have been some reversals for the Afghan forces. Taliban is gaining ground. Should the U.S. re-engage in Afghanistan in the war?
Well, unless we want Afghanistan to become the next Syria and Iraq. And in fact, there's the growth of ISIS presence in Afghanistan as well, which is not being well supported. We are in the middle of a troop drawdown. We're now seeing the Pentagon saying, hold on a second, we need to slow down the drawdown, and in fact, maybe perhaps reposition. Here's what's clear. Well, I always thought that these artificial numbers and artificial dates have been dangerous. In fact, if you look at our withdrawal schedule, it is almost exactly timed by the Taliban and other insurgent forces to take advantage of. When you know America is leaving on a date certain, you wait until that date certain. As soon as they leave, you move in, and that's what's happening. And here's the danger of this. It's not just the Taliban anymore. ISIS has been really underreported. ISIS is now actively growing in Afghanistan as well. They're involved in an open competition with the Taliban to become the leading terror group in the region. And so you can see, if this continues on the pace it's on right now, here's what the Middle East could look like in 12 to 18 months. Vacuums in Syria, vacuums in Iraq, and now a vacuum in Afghanistan. Massive, ungoverned spaces where radical jihadist groups can organize, train, and conduct operations. By the way, they're also in Libya. ISIS is operating out of Libya. They're using it to conduct operations in Sinai, which Egypt is having to deal with. They have affiliates now spread throughout portions of Africa as well. This is a very dangerous and growing situation. If you add Afghanistan to the mix, you've got a real problem on your hands.
So, if I'm hearing you correctly, you're saying larger American presence in Afghanistan, larger American presence in Syria, and an augmented American presence in Iraq as well.
Well, again, the American presence in Syria and Iraq that I'm talking about are special operations forces embedded alongside a Sunni fighting force combined with additional air support. In Afghanistan, we have an existing troop number that is apparently too low. That needs to be increased slightly, enough not just to be able to protect ourselves, but to help the Afghan national forces not continue to lose ground as is happening now.
So let's take a longer time horizon. What do we do in Afghanistan to create a stronger government that can actually take care of itself?
And that'll be a challenge. And I'm not telling you that Afghanistan is going to turn into Australia anytime in the near future. We need to continue to be committed to it in the hopes that one day they can create some level of stability. But what's happening now is the opposite. Well, part of what we were doing already, and it won't be easy. As I said, there will be bad stories that come out of it and difficult circumstances that emerge. It will take time, as it took in other parts of the world as well. And there are real cultural reasons why it will take even longer because of the tribal nature of that society and so forth. But we have to stay committed to that. We have to see that through even if it takes longer than anybody wants. Because the alternative is unacceptable. The alternative is an Afghanistan that collapses and becomes a prime operating space, just like it was for Al-Qaeda before 9/11. We cannot allow that to become a prime operating space. Forget about the Taliban at this point, for ISIS as well. That would be the alternative to us not continuing to remain engaged to some level.
So let's look at the longer-term game in Syria. Post-Assad, what do we have? What happened?
Well, that's why it's important for us to have gotten involved early. Now it's gotten harder. because there needs to be an alternative to Assad that is acceptable. And I'm not saying it's going to be, Benjamin Franklin or Abraham Lincoln that's going to be taking over, but someone whom we can work with. There were actually, Syrian army defectors. There were non-jihadist elements that had left that weren't perfect people, but they would have been a better alternative to what we now have. So I think the key for us is now to find responsible actors that we can begin to empower to create the outlines of what a post-Assad government can look like in Syria. And I think that begins by the creation of a safe haven from which they can organize and begin to operate and grow. Right now that doesn't exist. On the contrary, they're now being targeted by Russian air power.
The administration has pledged to take in 10,000 Syrian refugees. Is that enough or too much?
Well, let me start by saying I think America has always accepted refugees. I live in a community of refugees that came from Cuba. We did that after Vietnam, and we've done that with Nicaragua and other places. And in theory, we would be open to taking refugees that are feeling oppression. But refugees have to pass a background check, especially if they're coming from Syria, because we know for a fact that elements like ISIS are going to try to sneak people in. And so if 1,000 people come into the U.S. and 999 of them are good people, and one of them is an ISIS killer, we have a problem. The problem that we face in practice is that it's not easy to do background checks on people that are coming from Syria. And so while we may be willing to take in more refugees, the question I have is it possible to do? Is it possible to conduct the background checks and the vetting that is essential?
Because what do you think?
I think it's going to be very difficult. I really do. It's not impossible.
Take in no Syrian refugees?
I think
Is that what you're suggesting?
I think the better approach. I'm not saying no. Obviously, there are individuals and individual cases that you can examine, but I think the better approach is what I've outlined, and that is instead of continuing to see them flow into Europe and ultimately some come to the United States, let's create a safe zone within Syria using the no-fly zone and the combined Sunni forces along with Kurds and others, where people can go there instead of coming into Europe. It isn't good for anyone that they're crossing these dangerous journeys that they're making into Europe. It has potential to destabilize our NATO allies in Europe. These mass migrations are never good. And here's the other point. If you have 500,000 people or 1 million people permanently leave the Middle East, that will fundamentally alter the makeup of that region forever, including ancient Christian communities that have been driven out of Mosul, for example. After 2000, for the first time in 2,000 years, there are no Christian services in these cities. And we cannot accept that as a permanent thing. And so I think it's important for us to help people who want to stay in the region, be able to stay in the region and one day return to their ancestral homelands.
We have some great questions from the audience here today that came in, so let me pose a couple of those. One comes from Larry, he's from Cedar Rapids. He says, Senator, what represents the greatest national security threat for the next generation? Is it radical Islamic terror, Russia, or China?
Yes. I think they all pose threats in different degrees. Radical jihadists are going to be an ongoing threat that we face. It's a movement that continues to morph, but it has to be defeated. There's no accommodation with them. Once you understand, there is no way to coexist with radical Islam. It has to be defeated, and we have to be committed to it. The alternative to not being committed to it is to accepting defeat. So that continues to be an emerging and evolving threat that has taken on in the last few years characteristics we never anticipated. The use of social media to recruit fighters. Russia, we've discussed extensively. North Korea is a major threat. You have a lunatic in North Korea who possesses dozens of nuclear weapons potentially, and already possesses long-range missiles that are capable of hitting the United States. I think the China one is the one that will define largely the story of the 21st century. Because if you look throughout history, a status quo power, which is what we are, and a rising power almost invariably wind up in conflict. And that would be really bad news for the world. So from our sake, I think that the relationship with Russia from a 100-year view is the one that will have the biggest impact historically. And our hope is that it will be a cooperative one, but the indicators are not positive. You're seeing a Chinese government that's become increasingly aggressive, more interested in protecting the Communist Party than the future of China itself. And you're seeing them become more aggressive militarily in the South China Sea, for example.
And what should we do about that?
Well, that's why we have to have a naval capability that never, absolutely ever accepts the territorial claims that they're making. We should continue to sail ships through their claimed sea lanes that they say belong to them. We should never accept their air defense zones. We have to truly build up our capabilities in the Asia-Pacific region so that our allies that are part of our coalition there know that we're capable of living up to our defense commitments. I'm encouraged that the Japanese themselves are now looking to reinterpreting their constitution so that they can come to our collective self-defense. They're a great force multiplier. And I think there's an opportunity to partner with Australia, with India, with other nations in the region to provide a real counterbalance to what China's trying to do, which is to send an argument to the region that America is a power in decline. China is not going to dominate Asia. You might as well accept that and play under the rules that we're trying to rewrite. But that all begins with naval and air power and being able to have it in substantial numbers in that region.
Congressman Rogers sent in another question. This one relates to China. President Obama and Chinese President Xi just agreed not to conduct economic espionage against each other. The agreement has no enforcement mechanisms and implies that the U.S. conducts this kind of espionage, which it does not, the Congressman says. How would President Rubio deal with China on cybersecurity issues?
But first of all, I understand they never intend to keep this deal because there's a real cultural difference in how we view this issue. We have, in our culture, in our Western economic models that have been established and in the rules-based system of economics that have taken place since the end of the Second World War, we believe that if you invent something, it belongs to you and there should be laws that protect it. That concept does not exist in the political, cultural mindset of the Chinese leaders. So in their mind, stealing your adversary's ideas and their secrets is an acceptable thing. There's nothing wrong with it. And in fact, if it rapidly accelerates their rise to power, there's more of an incentive to do it. And this has deep historical justification in their mind that go back for thousands of years in different writings and so forth in their society. So this notion that they're going to stop spying on us is absurd. That they use espionage against our companies and our government as an acceptable form of statecraft, and they're not going to keep their word. The only way is we have to continue to build our cyber defenses by incorporating the latest and best technologies available in the private sector into government, but we must also have an offensive cyber capability. It must be clear to the Chinese that there is a price to pay for cyber espionage. Well, then they need to be used, and they need to be used more effectively, and we also need to be able to target individual Chinese companies and say, if you are engaged and involved in the stealing of American secrets and American intellectual property, you will not have access to the American economy. And we haven't been willing to do that as well. The cyber threat that I think is harder for us to contain because it doesn't have a similar sort of deterrent impact is against non-state actors. So you don't have to be a rich and developed country in order to have a cyber capability. So if the ISIS grows their cyber capabilities and they're able to say knock out the power grid of an American city, what do we retaliate against? The ISIS doesn't have a power grid. That's one we should really be worried about.
So you suggest that the U.S. government should be leveraging the abilities of U.S. tech companies. U.S. tech companies are a little angry right now with the U.S. government in the wake of Snowden's revelations. How do you promote a more productive relationship between the technology community and the U.S. government?
Well, look, a couple of points. The U.S. companies that have been doing technology business in China for years they used to come to the American government and argue, stop being so tough on the Chinese because we want to have more access to the market. Now that they're getting all their information stolen, now in order for them to operate in China, they need more cooperation. In order to operate in China, they have to turn over secrets to the Chinese government. Now they're making a reverse argument, which is you need to be tougher on China. Here's the bottom line with these tech companies and with everybody else. This country, the most important obligation of the federal government is for us to be safe. And to keep us safe means we must know more about our adversaries than they know about us. And so we have intelligence programs and we have laws that govern them. If any employee of the U.S. government is caught violating those laws, spying on Americans, listening in on phone calls, that person should be fired, prosecuted, and jailed. But I'm telling you, it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. The next time there's a major terror attack in the United States, the first question everyone's going to ask is, why didn't we know about it? Why didn't we disrupt it? And the answer cannot be, because we took apart the programs that allowed us access to that information.
So I gather you're not following Mr. Snowden on Twitter.
I consider Mr. Snowden to be a traitor. He has done more damage to a U.S. security than any recent revelation. In fact, there are American servicemen and women in uniform today around the world whose lives are potentially in danger because of the revelations he has made.
Great question from Pat in Cedar Rapids. Iowa, of course, does a lot of business in China. I think there's a soybean deal that was just inked that was worth a lot of money. How would you balance the economic interests of a state like Iowa, which exports billions of dollars of agricultural products to China against broader national security threats?
Well, I don't think they are in imbalance with one another. We would love more access to the Chinese market. There are a lot of people living in China. We would love to sell things to them, but it has to be fair. In essence, it has to be, for example, the Chinese and other countries, not just China, they impose not just tariffs, but all sorts of non-tariff impediments to trade and access to their economy. Part of it is the internal change that has to happen in China to move towards a more consumption-based model in their own economy. I think when it comes to agriculture, that's one thing. They need the food, they need the soy, they need the pork, and these sorts of things that in order to obviously feed their people. I think the bigger challenge in that balance comes in some of the other business deals in the technology world, and manufacturing, etc., where the Chinese, for example, if you manufacture in China, within 4 years, they've stolen the way you make it, and they do it themselves, and they don't need you anymore. That's a more threatening one. When it comes to agriculture, we want to continue to have access to their markets, and I don't think anything I've discussed here today would endanger it. They need our food just as much as we need their customers.
Matt from Marion asked, what is a proportionate response when a nation state, like China, for instance, uses cyber warfare against an American corporation?
Well, I think proportionate response has to be disproportionate. So in essence, I think that's always been the truth. Well, it depends on the incursion. But most certainly, a developed nation state like China has its own industries that are vulnerable to similar reaction, and they need to know it ahead of time. Today, they believe that they can get away with any sort of cyber attack they want without any reciprocal response. There will not only just be a reciprocal response, but also the indictment of the individuals who run that company. So those individuals no longer have access to it.
If we can really do
in many instances, we can. Well, we can see where the technology eventually winds up. When they steal an American corporate secret, it eventually winds up in the hands of a Chinese firm who then produces, using the technologies or the information we develop, they use that to produce a product to compete against ours in the global marketplace. And when you start indicting the individuals that run those companies, and they can no longer travel to the United States or send their kids to school here or buy property here, they're going to react to it as well. It's like anything else. The Chinese are actually rational actors. They're not the Ayatollah of Iran. They're rational actors. And as a result, they understand cost and benefit. And right now, the benefits of these cyber attacks far outweigh the costs.
The theft of intellectual property from U.S. corporations is not new. This has been going on for more than a decade. Do you think American business bears some of the responsibility for not protecting their own information more carefully?
Yeah, except that you have a nation state with a massive budget, spending a tremendous amount of money in developing ways to evade whatever it is this one company is doing to protect its information. In other instances, these were companies that were short-sighted. They were willing to go into China and do business because it was a huge market and they were promised they're going to have access. What they didn't realize is that once you started building things in China, the Chinese would figure out how you build it, they would reverse engineer it, and in 5 or 10 years they would kick you out because now they know how to do it themselves. And a lot of these companies were short-sighted in doing that. You're absolutely right. Even to this day, when I talk about China like this, you'll get visits and phone calls from some companies that say, don't be so tough on China, they're a good market for us. But at the end of the day, it's a short-sighted view. Many of these companies end up on the wrong end of it. Look, there's no Facebook in China. There's no Google in China. You can't access those. They have their own Facebook and their own Google controlled by the government.
Thomas from Manchester asked, would you strict U.S. citizenship from anyone who travels abroad to join us?
Yeah, I think you should lose your U.S. citizenship if you join an enemy of the United States, including an avowed one like ISIS.
Here's another one from Robert in Mount Vernon. Is the Department of Homeland Security worth keeping in its current form?
Well, it needs to continue to stay ahead of the curve. I think there are parts of the Department of Homeland Security that need to be improved. You talk about some of the airport security issues that we face and so forth. These things continue, I believe, need to be improved. And in fact, I think other nations, to some extent, do a better job at some of this than we've been doing. But overall, the concept of the Department of Homeland Security at this point, while I don't necessarily believe that perhaps we needed an entirely new bureaucracy to carry this out, to dismantle it at this point in the middle of this crisis might be really disruptive. But I'm not satisfied with the way any of our agencies work. They all have to perpetually improve in light of these new risks that we face. And I say that with the due respect to the men and women on the front line of these agencies who are doing the best they can with the tools that are being provided. I know there are some really good men and women out there working on behalf of our government that are doing the best that they can to keep us safe. But these programs have to work better. And in the instance of airport security and seaport security, I fear that our advantage against those who seek to attack us might be eroded.
Some people have suggested that one of the big problems with the Department of Homeland Security is the way congressional oversight is done. That there are scores of committees and subcommittees who claim some part of the department as their own. It was a recommendation from the 9/11 Commission that this be streamlined and centralized in order to take less time. It hasn't happened. Does Congress bear some responsibility?
Sure, absolutely. Congress bears some responsibility for a lot of things.
And the reason here.
And the reason why that happens, quite frankly, is because of committee chairmen that don't want to lose power.
Exactly.
Right? There's committees that have a piece of jurisdiction, they don't want to give up that jurisdiction.
Exactly.
I think that's where it's incumbent upon congressional leadership to step in and fix that. The issues of national security are the most important thing our government does. And the oversight over these agencies is important. It's also important that they be funded at an acceptable level, that they have the resources necessary to stay ahead of the curve on all of this. But absolutely, the Congress bears responsibility. Politics intrudes all of these things, unfortunately.
Did you make any efforts to reform the oversight of the Department of Homeland Security?
No, I'm not on the committee that oversees it. No, what I do conduct oversight over is the intelligence agencies, because I'm on the intelligence committee. And those are equally important, because much of what the Department of Homeland Security does is derived from information gathered by the intelligence agencies. And on that I've been very involved in continuing to try to improve the way we collect and disseminate intelligence within the U.S. government, which is an ongoing effort of improvement. And if I'm president, I have concrete ideas about how we can fix it. Unfortunately, I can't detail all of it today, but...
A little bit?
Well, I mean, I'll say this. I think we have various different agencies that collect intelligence, and we need to continue to find ways to be able to bring that all together in a way that makes sense.
Wasn't the DNI supposed to do that?
And it hasn't. There's still stovepiping, which basically means these different routes, and some in which intelligence is entering the DNI, and it hasn't still reached the point where all this information is being shared in a way that, to me, provides the most accurate assessment for the commander-in-chief and others to make decisions.
And you think you can kick those stovepipes down?
Absolutely, we'll need to. In fact, it's critical for 21st century intelligence programs to work, and I think it will take strong executive leadership to do it. Again, it goes back to entrenched bureaucracies. Even though you're well-intentioned, you're an intelligence agency, you've got a certain mandate. You don't want to give up power, because that human instinct is to say, I don't want to give up responsibility over this area, but we have to continue to improve the way that information flows so that it's available to the commander-in-chief and others, decision makers, faster and more reliably.
Danielle from Olin asked, how would you approach foreign aid and international development funding?
I support having foreign aid programs that work for the United States. It's less than 1% of our budget, and it provides great dividends if appropriately used. And there are good cases and bad cases of it. I cite two examples of where foreign aid has made a difference in the world. 3 decades ago, South Korea was a recipient state, a military dictatorship, an American ally. But U.S. aid helped them to develop. Today, they are a democracy, and I believe the 8th or 9th largest economy in the world, and a net donor to foreign aid, no longer a recipient. Another place where foreign aid and military assistance made a big difference is Colombia. Colombia was on the verge of being a failed state less than 2 decades ago. Today, they are potentially our strongest and most capable ally in the Western Hemisphere, outside obviously of Canada and South America. They're by far our most capable and reliable ally. And that's a direct result of American engagement. There are millions of people in the African continent alive today because you, the American taxpayer, funded antiviral medications that kept them alive, and they know it came from America. It's going to be really hard to recruit them to join radical Islamist groups to kill Americans after America saved their lives. And then there are examples of where foreign aid doesn't work quite well. For example, in Haiti. I think it's completely unacceptable that so many years after this earthquake, after billions of dollars have poured into Haiti, you still have houses not constructed, rubble still in the streets, and children literally eating cookies made of dirt just to fill their stomachs so that it doesn't have any nutrient impact. I think that's unacceptable.
You've also talked a lot here today about an expanded U.S. military presence. You've referenced the Southern Sea, needing to do more there, the Middle East, of course. You talked about a more robust presence in the Arctic. Where's that money coming from?
First of all, defense spending isn't the reason why we have a debt. The United States debt is being driven by the way Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid are structured for future generations. That's why I believe in entitlement reform. I'm from Florida. There are a lot of people in Florida on Medicare and Social Security. My mother's one of them. I'm against anything that's bad for my mother. And here's the good news. But here's the good news. The good news is if we act now, we can keep those programs, Medicare and Social Security, exactly the way they are now for my mother or people like her or people who are about to retire. It'll have to work differently for me and for my generation. I'll have to retire a year later than she did. If I've been financially successful, my benefits won't grow as fast. And that's where the debt problem is. We need to get rid of the sequester on defense spending. It's absurd what we are doing. We are on pace to have the smallest and oldest Air Force and Navy that we've had in generations. We're cutting another 40,000 positions out of the Army. We just talked today about all these threats around the world, and we are shrinking our military capabilities. You know, for 3 months...
But we're operating under a continuing resolution.
I agree. And if we do that again in December, there will be contracts that the Air Force and the Navy will have to cancel. For example, the tanker, the refueling tanker.
So who do you blame for this?
Both parties. I voted against the sequester. I thought it was a terrible idea. This was the purpose back in 2011, I think, when this passed. It was, we're going to make the cuts that we're making to defense are so ridiculous that it will force Congress to reach a deal on entitlements. Well, guess what? They underestimated Congress's ability to do ridiculous things because the sequester is still there, and the entitlement reforms dropped off the radar. So these are not sustainable. This is making the world a very dangerous place, and I blame the president because what the president is saying is, I'll increase defense spending, but for every dollar we add in defense, we have to add to some domestic program. And I honestly just think that before we spend money on anything, we fully fund our national security. It is the single most important thing the federal government does. It is the reason why we have a federal government to begin with.
I want to get a couple more questions in here before we wrap
I'll
up.
talk a bit faster.
Carl from Cedar Rapids asked, what is the most significant national security priority in Latin America?
That's a great question. First of all, believe it or not, is Russia and China beginning to spread its influence in Latin America. For example, both countries have intelligence gathering stations in Cuba. Both countries are exploring permanent base operations in Nicaragua. And of course, Venezuela is a country that has links to both Russia, China, and also Iran. So I would say, but beyond nation states, the other threat we face in Latin America that directly impacts the United States is transnational criminal groups in the Northern Triangle, Central America, and also Mexico that contribute to migratory crisis on our border, drugs, human trafficking. This is a growing threat, particularly in Mexico and in Guatemala and Honduras.
Senator, we're almost out of time, and I want to ask you to go back to the subject you started with. You said we're barreling towards a second Cold War.
Yes.
Are we already there?
I hope not.
And does anything you propose prevent us from going there, or does it accelerate the process?
No, I hope we're not on the verge of the second Cold War, because between the United States and Russia, we possess over 90% of the world's nuclear weapons. And I hope that we're not reaching that point. What we know about Vladimir Putin is that he operates on the basis of cost-benefit. He, too, is a rational actor. And he operates on for example, he's involved in a Ukrainian incursion because he believes the benefits far outweigh the costs that have been imposed. If he ever believes that the costs of invading or taking on a Baltic state are outweighed by the benefits, he would do that as well. So I think the only way to confront this is to change the cost-benefit analysis for him. And if we can do that, if we can change the cost-benefit analysis for Vladimir Putin, I think we can hold off on this continuing to accelerate until such time as Russia, one way or the other, gets a new leader that actually helps that country fulfill its potential to be a great country and a responsible state, as opposed to the sort of thuggery that we're now seeing from its government in Moscow. Thank you. It's very good. Thank you.